Thank you so much for agreeing to join us on a By the Bookshelf chat so that we can talk about Bluebird, which is coming out on Tuesday. So exciting. So why don't we start off by saying, like, can you tell us a little bit about Bluebird and what it's about?
Yes, I will be happy to. So, Bluebird is probably one of the most intense books I've ever written and one of the most complex research projects I've ever done for sure. The story focuses on Eva, who is a German immigrant coming to New York City in 1946. But she is not coming to seek a new life like so many other immigrants. She is running from one war and stepping straight into another far colder one. And she is seeking justice and a Nazi that has slipped the net of justice. And she's bringing a secret with her. And the secret is Project Bluebird. And that is information that neither the Americans nor the Soviets should ever have.
Amazing. I have to say, obviously, just like an absolute page turning like mystery thriller. It's really like, it is really quite insane to read, because you're kind of like going back and forth and trying to figure out, what the secret is and what it means. So, talking about like the kind of research that you did and also, the process of writing this book, like, can you tell us a little bit about like what an undertaking of a research project this was and how you kind of like were able to plot all of this out?
Yes, yes, I can absolutely. Ask me anytime about the research. Any author's like, yes, I can tell you all about my research. So basically, Bluebird is the bringing together of two pieces of forgotten American history. And that first piece of forgotten history is a place called Powell House. And Powell House was a program that was being run by Quaker volunteers from an exclusive mansion on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And the basic reason for the program was to extend practical help, friendship, and unconditional love to the refugees of war who were restarting their lives in America. And this was a multiracial, multi-religious, such a diverse program for its time. Honestly, it was hard to believe that it even existed. And there was nothing too big or too small that they would not help with. And they were such a light of their time. And it's something that really nobody even remembers existed. And it brought together all of these organizations, Catholic organizations, the Jewish Women's Council, Protestant churches, the churches of Harlem, where they went and had dinner once a week, the Guggenheim, Hunter University, the Urban League. All of these people were coming together to help immigrants that came through Powell House. And it was just an amazing program that honestly gives me hope for the world in general. And then the other piece of history that shocked me for completely opposite and different reasons was Project Bluebird. And Project Bluebird was something that I was completely unaware of until I started digging actually on the CIA's website, where there are so many documents now that are available through the Freedom of Information Act. But Project Bluebird was a secret CIA operation that was begun just at the end of World War II. And the purpose of this was medical experimentation that was done on unwitting and unconsenting, often on American citizens, and for the purposes of mind control. So it seems like science fiction, but they really did believe that they could create the perfect spies, the perfect assassins, that they could take over someone's mind and make you a killer without you ever knowing that that's what was happening to you. And not only were these experiments being done, funded by our government on our own citizens, but we were hiring Nazi war criminals to do them. These were experiments that came straight from the records of the Dachau concentration camp.
My gosh, it's like horrifying to think that that is something that is in our quite recent history, and but also like very similar to what I felt when I read The Light in Hidden Places. Like, you balance the light and the dark of these things. There's like these horrible atrocities happening, but also people who are helping. And so I think it's just fascinating that you brought these two pieces of history together so beautifully in both of your most recent books. And I'm also just curious, like, were you just like generally doing research, kind of looking for your next project and came across this? Or was there something that like triggered you to start looking into this?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, how do you get to all these places?
Yeah.
Like, funny little bunny trails, that lead you from one place to the other. But I can say that I started looking into post-war very hard after I wrote The Light in Hidden Places. When I was writing that book, one of the things as part of my research that I really wanted to do was to create a balanced view of the war. I wanted to understand what Germans thought of the war, how many Germans wanted, to be a German soldier, and not all of them did. They were also, under the rule of Hitler. So I listened to hours and hours of oral testimonies, oral histories of Germans who lived through World War II and its aftermath. And what really struck me were the stories of the teenagers, particularly the teenage girls who had grown up under the era of the Third Reich. They had no sense that the world was any different than the world of Hitler. And for all of them, it was such a profound moment when they realized just what they had actually been involved in. Some of them denied it. They could not cope with that. Some of them spent years trying to atone. Others. It was just such a profound human problem. Like, what do you do when you realize that the monsters aren't over there? They're right here. Your parents were monsters. You might have been a monster. And how do you come away from that? How do you change? And that is really the heart of the story, I think, that I wanted to write. How do you change? And then I found programs that really were addressing not only people's physical needs, but the needs of their heart. And then I also discovered, the other exact opposite that was going on, and how we continued a lot of the atrocities that began in the concentration camps. And so I think that balance, for me, like you were talking about, of dark and light, that was actually very profound for me. I was writing this story in the midst of the pandemic. I was creating, the actual writing in the story, and it was a very dark time. But even just writing my own story, I think this is really the power of story. It can even be your own, that affects you. But I think it really showed me that, for every Project Bluebird, there is a Powell House. For every injustice, there's a Stefania Podgorska who's going to stand up. So I think that understanding that light is always there, even when we can't see it, even when we don't know their names, even when they've been forgotten, they were always there. And that gives me just a huge amount of hope, I think, for our world.
Yeah, I completely agree. I loved everything you said about the heart of the book being about, how you move past atrocities and the people who are there to help. And the way that
And
this book is
capacity to change.
yes,
Really
yes.
what I wanted to write about. We have that capacity.
Yeah, not being locked into, the like horrifying things of the past or the world that you've been brought up in, like being able to escape that, I think is something very, very powerful
That's
that you
right.
explore in this. And the way that you structure this book is also very fascinating. You know, thinking about post-war and the very end of the war, this book is two perspectives flashing back between right after the war with Eva and then right at the end of the war, like as things are starting to fall apart for, you know, a young girl in Nazi Germany. So
Mhm.
I would love for you to kind of like talk about what it was like to structure your novel in this way. Like, was that a significant challenge, or did you find it kind of like fun to go back and forth between these two stories?
I think in the middle of writing it, I thought I'd done a terrible thing to myself because it wasn't. It seemed like such a good way to tell this story, but it wasn't the easiest way to tell the story because the first half of the book toggles back and forth between 1946 and 1945, like you said. But even later, as the storylines converge, I'm still going back and forth from the present to a more distant past and some traumas that were in
Yes.
a more distant past. And I really wanted for these to not feel like abrupt changes back and forth. I wanted to connect each chapter thematically. So, you know, whatever was happening in 1946 thematically matched what was happening in 1945 and so on. And this was not an easy task to figure out the right way to structure, but I'm also really, really happy with the way that turned out. I felt great about it once I got it done. I did question whether I was insane for trying while I was writing it, though.
Well, I definitely think it worked. I remember when I was reading it, going like getting to the end of like one chapter and being like, oh my God, I need to know what happens. And then getting to the next chapter and being like, oh, right, in the previous chapter, I really needed to know what happened here. And it just kind of kept it like literal definition of a page turner, in my opinion.
Oh, I'm glad you think so. I think it also though reflects something in me where I feel that time is so connected. I feel so connected to what came before and to the things that have come together to make my life what it is, to make this world what it is. And I think there was something satisfying. It's probably why I kept trying and trying to get it right, because there's something very satisfying with showing those connections through time, that we are not, that our world is not existing in isolation. It is the culmination of all the human stories that have come before. And so showing that connection across years is something that's always satisfying to me, because that's just something I think about a lot.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to kind of tie together and know that, you know, your experiences aren't existing in a vacuum and that there are all of these impacts. I'm very curious, did you write like when you were writing this, did you also go back and forth each chapter? Did you kind of write like the storylines through individually and then put them together?
Oh, I have to tell the story to myself in
Mhm.
in a linear way, like the way I want the reader to perceive it. I know so many other writers who are so great at, you know, skipping ahead, writing this scene that they're envisioning, and then they write this scene that they're envisioning, and then they go and connect it together and it works beautifully. And I wish I could do that, and I absolutely can't. Um, I have to experience the story when I'm writing it the way I want the reader to experience it. And so yeah, that's probably why it was harder. Honestly, it would have
Yeah.
been easier if I had been able to do that. But I always have to tell my stories to myself in a linear way. I guess it's just the way my brain works.
Yeah,
So
I mean, you are your first reader. Like you are, you know,
yeah, I never
yeah,
thought
it's
of it that way, but that is so absolutely true. Yeah.
yeah, like I feel like before, you know, a book, especially like as a published author, you always know that your stories are eventually going to have more readers, but like there is something nice about the quietness of like telling yourself a story first.
I have to trick my with that exact thought, actually, because I find that, you know, I put so much of myself into my work. It's it's really a very vulnerable thing, to then, put your soul into something and then have it be published and put it out in the world and say, everybody say, well, judge that, here's some of my soul,
Yeah.
and have a look at that and tell me what you think about it. It's a very vulnerable thing, and I think it takes a lot of courage actually to be a writer, which sometimes I don't always completely have, probably. So a lot of times what I'll do, even if a book is under contract, even if I've already sold it, I'll tell myself, I'm just writing right now, and maybe I'll never actually show this to anyone. Maybe no one will ever read it. Maybe it's just for me, and I'll never, even if, I actually have a deadline of which I have to do that. I try to exist in that little bubble, and it actually
Mhm.
really helps me to do that. It keeps the pressure, of
Mhm.
expectations away, and it allows me to tell a story, I think, that is, maybe very authentic to me, because I do that, but it's also just psychological treatment
Yeah, you have to trick yourself a little
of
bit.
my neuroses.
I mean, I feel like probably a lot of writers feel that way. And just in general, like, you said a lot about your writing process here. But like, do you have any like advice for like aspiring writers who might be interested in writing in general, but especially for a historical fiction novel, which is something that like you really are incredible at, like just engrossing people in that world. So I'm curious, like what your advice for that might be.
Well, I think my first advice, foremost, for any writer, no matter what you're writing, is write your passion. Write write that thing that sparks that passion in you. And I've talked about this from the very beginning because it's something I feel so strongly about, that when you are engaging that passion for something, for a character, for a setting, for a story, for a certain history, whatever it is that sparks that in you, there's this magical process that when you engage that, somehow it pours out onto the page. And I don't understand how or why this happens, but not only does it pour out, but then the reader feels it. It's this completely magical process that's been going on. It's been going on since I was becoming a reader. I was just catching other people's passion. So my number one thing is always write your passion. But as far as like specifically writing for history, when you do in-depth research into a subject that you're passionate about, like for me, Bluebird or Powell House, for this one, I got so much information, and it's really hard when you are so interested in something to not incorporate every
Everything.
single thing that you found out, into a book. But I think what's really good to remember is that anytime you're writing, you're not actually writing about a history. You're writing about a character's experience, and the details that matter are the details that affect your character and their immediate life. And that's what we need to know. The story is about the character, not about a historical setting. It's just that's where your character happens to live. And so while you need enough detail for that to feel real and believable, I think, the other things that don't directly affect your character, even when they're fascinating, don't necessarily belong. And it's really hard to weed those out.
Yeah, I can imagine there must be so many things that like you would want to include, but then it would just end up being probably a 1,000 page historical
I
like
could so
tome.
easily write you a 1,000-page
Yeah.
historic. I don't think you want me to.
I mean, maybe. I'm fascinated by everything in here. So, but was there anything that like, you in your research you came across that either was like incredibly fascinating that did make it into the book, or if you can think of anything that didn't make it into the book that you also found really cool?
Oh gosh, that didn't make it into the book. Well, I think a lot of I'll just say that my research into Powell House, which I'm so excited about, I guess you can tell. My research into Powell House, how I met so many incredible people. I was able to sit and listen and meet with a woman, a Quaker woman who worked in Powell House as a volunteer in her early 20s. And she was 99 years old at the time. She was almost about to turn 101.
My
And
gosh.
she's read the book and she's in the book. And it was just, she told me so many stories, so many amazing people passed through that program with incredible backgrounds and incredible stories of their own. And she was studying to be a social worker at the time, and she wrote case. It was just incredible. All of the stories that she told.
Sorry, you froze for a little bit there, but I think I caught most of what you said. So I just wanted to make sure that you could also still see me.
You're still,
Um,
yeah, yeah, you're frozen for me, so I don't know why.
okay, I think we might be back
I
now.
can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can. Yeah.
All right, great. We're good. We're good. Yeah.
Yes.
But anyways, you were saying that you heard all these incredible stories from this woman who had worked in Powell House in her 20s.
Yes, yes. And she told me stories of, refugees and people and their experiences in the war, and what they did after. And I wish I could have included all of them. They were obviously didn't directly affect Eva's. Refugees that I portray in the book have.
Oh, that's really nice to like know that there were, I'm sure that you could write probably two more books
Oh, did we
about
lose
people who
each
passed
other?
through Powell House. Um, and like, or like short stories, but everyone, I'm sure, and it's fascinating that like, we don't know anything about this that was such an incredible program in our history that, I feel like sometimes we focus in history on the darker things and forget about the light. And I think that can be really really disarming to, think that everything was so dark and focused on the tragedy when there were people, just as there are people today, like continuing to fight for what they believe in.
Very quietly bringing light to the world. I think that's what they were doing. The American Friends Service Committee is the group that ran Powell House. And in 1947, they won the Nobel Peace Prize for their global humanitarian relief efforts that had been going on actually since World War One. The
Wow.
contribution that they made to the world is mostly forgotten, but the impact will never be known. I truly believe that. These were lives incredibly well lived, and I think they do deserve to be celebrated just as much as we all need to understand the nuances of the history with things like Project Bluebird. I think what shocked me about that is that as many good things as we did, we went in, we helped defeat Hitler. That was a thing. Hitler had to be stopped, but we weren't always on the side of right. And I think that's an important.
Sorry, you froze for a second, but I got what you said that we were, that like the nuance of history. But yeah, and I also think that like, the impact of Powell House, like, also like you bringing it back to the forefront through Bluebird, like so many more people are going to understand, what the impact of this was, and, that you are telling these stories. So I think that that also is really a beautiful thing about historical fiction, that it is like bringing light to stories that we wouldn't have known about before or might not have saw. I want to ask you just one final question. What book would you recommend to readers who are fans of your historical fiction, who have read The Light and Hidden Places, about to read Bluebird, and just want to keep reading about history in these ways?
That is such, yeah, that is so hard to choose just one book. But I would have to say, anything by Ricci, I think all of those are just great comps if you enjoy Bluebird.
Amazing. Amazing. So a great reading list for people. Bluebird is on sale on Tuesday, October 5th. Definitely make sure you pre-order it so that you can read it right away. You're going to tear through it. I promise. It's incredible. So Sharon, thank you so much for this incredible conversation, for taking the time to talk to us here at I Read YA. We really, really appreciate it. And this has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me and for doing this today. It's always so fun to talk to you. And thanks for the IT help and for dealing with my frozen face. I appreciate it.
Listen, Instagram always wants to test us, but we got through it and we still had a great conversation. So it all works out. All right. I'll talk to you later, Sharon.